Today we're going to talk about the relationship between trauma and memory in light of the political upheaval caused between this Christine Blasey Ford, Brett Kavanaugh situation. The trauma science has been utilized by both political sides in order to vindicate or legitimize a political bias. And what I'm going to do is actually survey the trauma literature and apply it to the political situation in a way that honors the science. This trauma concept has basically become the epicenter of political hysteria in light of the allegations that psychology professor Christine Blasey Ford has brought against the now confirmed Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh during his judiciary hearing. Now, Ford has alleged that in the summer of 1982, Kavanaugh pulled her into a room, held her down, attempted to take off her clothes, laughed about it, kept pinning her down, and she eventually was able to escape from the room. Those are the allegations, which, if they were true, would be sexual assault. Now, Kavanaugh fiercely denied these allegations. And so there was a mad scramble among journalists to conscript evidence from the trauma science on either side to vindicate a particular political position. So while this investigation into the incident, it found no corroborating evidence per se, there still stirred a parallel argument about how psychological science, about the traumatic experience of victims of abuse, and in what sense that science might give us some concrete grounding to confirm a bias for or against Ford's allegations. So in other words, journalists and politicians and even Blasey Ford herself and her testimony, which we're going to look at, basically turned to trauma science to authenticate the veracity of these allegations. So here, I only intend to speak to the science of trauma itself. There are so many angles to this thing. There are speculative accounts of how certain situations could or could not be true. There are the politics of it. There are the nature of the judiciary confirmation process. I'm not interested in any of that. I'm taking this thin perspective, this thin slice in which I've done a lot of studying during my doctoral work, and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to speak to this. I'm going to speak to the utilization of trauma science for or against a particular political bias in this particular situation, because that needs to be cleared up, because what's happening right now is so sloppy, and it is perpetuating mythology of trauma, which is harmful to both political sides. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the way in which boyhood abuse and trauma can shape the religious experience of abused boys as they become adults. Okay, that's what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. I spent 5 years researching this. Okay, I'm not a psychologist. My PhD is in religious studies. So these are the allegations and the surrounding science used to corroborate these allegations in an indirect way. So when Senator Dianne Feinstein asked, how are you sure that it was he? Basically, she was asking Blasey Ford, how are you sure it was Brett Kavanaugh? She answered that I'm going to read Blasey Ford's testimony. Blasey Ford answered, the same way that I'm sure that I'm talking to you right now, just basic memory functions and also just the level of norepinephrine and epinephrine in the brain. She said, quote, the neurotransmitter encodes memories into the hippocampus, and so the trauma-related experience then is kind of locked there, whereas other details kind of drift. Then Feinstein asked her, so, quote, what you're telling us is this could not be a case of mistaken identity, end quote. And Ford replied, quote, absolutely not, end quote. And then Richard Huganier, a neuroscience professor at Johns Hopkins University, he also commented about the situation to the Washington Post. He said, quote, the person lying on top of you, who she'd previously met, you're not going to forget that. There's a total consensus in the field of memory. If anything, fear and trauma enhances the encoding of memory at a molecular level, end quote. And then one more self-identified expert on sexual trauma commented, quote, according to what we know about traumatic memory, it's more likely that her recall is accurate than it is that Kavanaugh's is, because it's stored in a different part of the brain. All of the cortisol and the frontal cortex activity that occurs during trauma makes it impossible for it to fade, end quote. And we are going to here sort of delineate the problems with these statements relative to trauma science, as well as the gross misuse of these concepts in the political arena. So we are in a phase right now politically where we are in the midst of what Ian Hacking calls the utilization of the trauma memory relation by political actors. And he calls this memoropolitics. memorial politics. And he's basically, which is basically just a way of using the trauma concept to vindicate or to condemn certain political actors by casting them as victims or perpetrators, thereby socially saving them or killing them, or politically saving them or killing them. And there's one scholar named Dr. Ruth Lays, who is a history professor at Johns Hopkins University, and she traces the history of the trauma concept in her University of Chicago monograph, Trauma: A Genealogy. And she recounts a time when trauma research was used against victims to undercut the credibility of their testimony. Lays says, quote, "One example of a painful conundrum. In the first legal test of the movement to make rape an indictable war crime, lawyers for the accused were able to exploit the fact that the Muslim victim of repeated rape was diagnosed as suffering from PTSD by demanding a halt to the trial on the grounds that the traumatized woman's suggestibility made her testimony and memories suspect." And so Lays basically concludes that it's common for apprehension about the trauma data to arise when she puts it this way, that suspicion arises when, quote, "the attribution of trauma appears to be made by lawyerly fiat," end quote. And so all political utilization of trauma science ought to raise skepticism about this sort of utilization, okay? Conservative, leftist, for, against, okay? Believe all men, believe all women, all of this political utilization ought to raise suspicion about the use of trauma science, okay? Not that science can't be utilized in legal settings, but when the appearance of a scholarly consensus is fabricated in order to justify bias for or against a particular allegation, that is bad and is unscientific. Okay, it is not good, and we need to be wary of that. Okay, so that's sort of an introduction to the political use of this trauma science. Okay, does trauma dogmatically verify or guarantee the accuracy of a statement? That's something we're going to look into in a bit. Okay. So all of this question about the use of trauma science for political ends, it gives rise to a more fundamental issue about trauma science itself. And what we need to realize is that there is no consensus about what trauma is or how to approach it in the scientific community. Richard McNally, who is professor of psychology at Harvard University, he comments this in his book, Remembering Trauma. He comments this, quote, "How victims remember trauma is the most divisive issue facing psychology today. Some experts believe that rape, combat, and other horrific experiences are engraved in the mind, never to be forgotten. Others believe that the mind protects itself by banishing traumatic memories from awareness, making it difficult for many people to remember their worst experiences until many years later." End quote. So realize what he just said. How victims remember trauma is Harvard professor of psychology, Richard McNally, says that how victims remember trauma is the most divisive issue facing psychology today. Okay. Now, a classic conception of PTSD models basically the relationship between trauma and memory like this, that the traumatic event is too overwhelming for the psyche, so the event embeds itself in the subconscious, and certain artifacts from the trauma, which stimulate something approximating the subject's ability to speak literally about the trauma, induce an out-of-body or an overwhelming experience that accompanies the avoidance of the literal, so that they do not have to face or recount or literally bear witness to the trauma. And that is called dissociation, okay? Because trauma is a matter of subjective experience rather than objective fact. And we're going to get to the distinction between abuse and trauma in a second, okay? But the relationship of trauma to memory in any given individual is always dubious and uncertain. It never guarantees certainty. At the very least, there are no universal principles which dictate the mechanics of trauma in a way that can predict a strong relationship between traumatic intensity and the accuracy of memory about trauma, because trauma cuts sort of against the grain of literality, so that in the sense that trauma becomes frozen and embedded and remembered within the survivor of trauma, it also remains out of reach, which is what induces post-traumatic symptomatology. So the degree to which someone is suffering from post-traumatic symptoms is the degree to which trauma has become enduring, yes, but also out of inaccessible to the conscious mind and inexpressible in literal terms to the survivor. And we're going to get to that more in a little bit. So Ford is right to claim that the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine stimulate a greater cooperation between the amygdala and the hippocampus, which, the norepinephrine and epinephrine are neurological binding hormones which are released, which facilitate the cooperation of the amygdala and the hippocampus, okay? And so this agreement or this cooperation reductively is the cooperation of the affective and the intellective neurocognitive anchors of our consciousness, okay? So the relationship between this noradrenergic system has been linked with the improvement of memory function for that reason. So mechanically what she said makes sense in terms of possibility, and there is some minor science which facilitates the plausibility of this account, and it makes sense. And this isn't really a profound statement. So what Blasey Ford said, and we're going to dig into that a little more in a second, what she said about the relationship between norepinephrine and epinephrine and the hippocampus, it makes sense that in a stressful situation, memory would be encoded with a sharpened focus on a smaller set of details. That makes sense. You don't need to be an expert in traumatology to know that. And in that sense, the comment by the neuroscientist from Johns Hopkins University is not stating something that profound to say that. But yet, at the same time, a recent meta-analysis published in the journal Clinical Psychological Science noted that, quote, individuals with PTSD, a history of trauma or depression, are at risk of producing false memories when they are exposed to information that is related to their knowledge base. So basically what all that comes down to is that, okay, that doesn't guarantee the accuracy of Blasey Ford's comments, and trauma doesn't guarantee the inaccuracy of her comments. So PTSD diagnosis or history of trauma can't be used as a foundation to write off her experience or to nullify her testimony, but at the same time can't be used as a basis to verify her testimony or to legitimize the veracity of her testimony. So what we need to do, and what the trauma science is really telling us, is that we need to stop being pretend experts on trauma. Just because the concept is becoming more popular, that doesn't mean the trauma concept is becoming more simple or easy or has more common sense cash value for us culturally and intellectually and psychological. It does not. We have to stop overplaying our hand in our placing a rush order on psychological science to the front row of our political line infantry. We must stop doing this because traumatic experience is highly phenomenological, and we're trying to rely on, remember what McNally called the most divisive issue facing science today. We are reducing it to dogmatisms based on an illusion of consensus that doesn't really exist. We are using these subjective phenomenological data to dictate objective, external, historiographical realities, and the connection which exists in reality is simply not that strong. And more importantly, traumatic experience is highly phenomenological and easily fabricated by suggestion. And therefore, the popularization of a false sense of certainty about trauma and about how trauma works will cultivate a culture of victimhood that takes its cue from the needs of the political elite rather than the science itself. And that is not a good direction for the popular culture to go. It will result in mob rule that is uninformed and not exercising its authority or its power for the proper good of the people. And this raises the issue of the very nature of trauma and its relationship to events. So again, when Senator Feinstein asked Ford if she could be mistaken about the identity of her assailant, Ford commented, absolutely not. Okay, she said she was 100% certain that it was Kavanaugh. Okay. Let me just make a small semantic point. Really? You couldn't be mistaken. It's impossible. Because Elon Musk thinks that we're all living in a computer simulation. So the possibility that there's no such thing as an external world out there is as old as Rene Descartes, okay, and extends today to philosophers, like Bertrand Russell sort of dealt with this idea and hosted this idea, and Nick Bostrom, facilitates this idea, and so. Of course, that's just sort of a little bit of a hyperbole. Simulation theory isn't actually relevant to whether Kavanaugh assaulted Ford, but for Ford to say that it is absolutely impossible for her to be mistaken in light of not only just in light of the conflicting research surrounding the trauma concept in relation to memory, but also the dubious nature of memory, well, to say absolutely not. So it couldn't be a case of mistaken identity. Well, that's a hyperbole, which is a rhetorical exaggeration, and that introduces hyperbole into the conversation. And there is something ironic and counterintuitive about the use of hyperbole to stress the accuracy of a statement. Okay, so using rhetorical exaggeration, that she is absolutely certain that she couldn't have been mistaken, which is hardly true of any 36-year-old memory, to forcefully assert the exact precision of her historical recounting. It's just odd, okay? It's utilizing two rhetorical modes going in different directions. But there is a more fundamental reality beneath the relationship between trauma, memory, and accuracy that really requires our attention. The utilization of science in defense of Ford, that is by Richard Hugoneer, the John Hopkins neuroscience, and by Blasey Ford himself or herself, they have in common the use of science in defense of Ford have in common the presumption that the display of post-traumatic stress translates roughly into a reliable equation of certainty with accuracy, and therefore with truthfulness. So there are two relationships, operational relationships here, which are dubious, but assumed to be solid by Blasey Ford and by Hugoneer, okay? And those are the relationship between PTSD symptoms and certainty. Well, that's a dubious relationship, but it's assumed to be solid. And then the relationship between certainty and truthfulness, another relationship that is dubious, but is presumed to be solid in these arguments. PTSD symptomatology. It indicates the experience of trauma, and the certainty contained in the traumatic experience does not translate straightforwardly into the sort of trustworthy certainty that ought to be taken with unquestionable veracity. And more than that, certainty does not translate into truthfulness. So there is no psychological mechanism, trauma least of all, that guarantees a person is accurately or truthfully recounting history in a memory. None. So there's a traumatologist who's become very popular lately named Bessel van der Kolk, and he comments, and I want to recount this comment. I want to recount this quote accurately. So Van der Kolk comments that victims of abuse, and he comments in an article that he published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress, that victims of abuse are likely to be, quote, vulnerable to suggestion and to the construction of explanations for their trauma-related affects that may bear little relationship to the actual realities of their lives, end quote. There's another psychologist named Sven Christensen, and he's a professor of psychology at Stockholm University who specializes in forensic traumatology with a special reference to memory, I think. And Christensen insists that psychologists must always operate with the sober recognition that they are dealing with memories, not histories per se. So he says, quote, one usually does not know for sure what the original circumstances were, only what the person claims they were. That is it, end quote. That is the posture of a psychologist. Okay? That is the posture of a good psychologist. And Ford herself, who specializes in psychological statistics, she is a social statistician who knows this more than anybody, okay? So the basic point here is this. Trauma is a phenomenological concept. This means that trauma is a word we use to describe a certain gloss that appears on the subjective experience of those who survive overwhelming experiences. It is a word that we use to describe an internal world of a survivor, okay? Any use of this trauma concept to guarantee accuracy or to suggest a heightened epistemological access to certainty, recall, or autobiography from a historical perspective is simply not aligned with the current science, and it's not aligned with philosophy, and it's not aligned with what we know about common sense, okay? Do abuse survivors require sympathy and acceptance from their therapists? Yes, of course. But the traumatic experience of survivors is not uniform. It is very diverse. So this appeal to psychological or traumatological dogma reflects a lack of awareness of the literature, okay? And it's very popular today to pretend you're a trauma expert, but you're not actually up to date on the trauma literature, okay? And there is a spectrum of survivors. There is a spectrum of trauma experiences. And on that spectrum, there are those who have accurate and hyper-attuned certainty that truthfully corresponds to reality, and there are those whose remembrance of the traumatic event is occluded and distorted by the overwhelming and post-traumatic symptoms of the event itself. And both ends of this spectrum will present post-traumatic symptomatology, which means that post-traumatic symptomatology cannot be used as an indicator of the historical accuracy of an account, nor where the survivor falls on the spectrum of psychologically accurate or psychologically occluded. We can't do that kind of analysis from the outside. We cannot. In a therapy session, over time, you can gather evidence on a case-by-case basis. Okay? But these public commentators simply do not have the credibility or the access to make these sort of conclusions based on micro indications and conjecture. Okay? Now we move into understanding the phenomenological nature of trauma. We've kind of done that, but then this points us toward the significance of traumatic symptomatology. So when someone is manifesting post-traumatic symptomatology, what does that mean about the historical veracity of their recounting a traumatic event? Traumatic symptomatology is a function of packed or suppressed traumatic memory. So therefore, the greater the traumatic dysregulation, the less cognitively conscious the survivor likely is of the original trauma. So Blasey Ford, she tells in her testimony a tale of increased traumatic symptomatology, claustrophobia, inability to fly, things like that, over the course of her life, including various phobias, okay? And these psychopathologies could have developed independently or symbiotically with trauma, okay? They don't necessarily indicate, well, they certainly don't indicate anything necessarily about the situation of the case, but to the degree that they are traumatic symptoms, right, and not symbiotic or independent. So to the degree that these symptoms are trauma-induced or traumatic symptomatology per se, then their quantity exists on an inverse sliding scale with the degree to which she can consciously recall her memories. Okay, and that's sort of, I mean, that's if you buy into typical trauma theory, which we're going to get to in a little bit. Okay, but according to typical trauma theory, especially in the cognitive behavioral world, to the degree that she's unpacked her trauma and can consciously express with accuracy and what we're going to look at in a second, called to the degree that she's able to gain conscious what they call specular distance from her trauma, the less traumatic symptomatology she's going to have, which is a psychological notion that comes from the psychologist Genet, who Bessel van der Kolk uses and is becoming repopularized with humanist trauma theorists today. But in other words, the worse she really is psychopathologically in regard to her trauma, the less she ought to be able to consciously recall. Okay, again, that they according to typical trauma theory, traumatic symptomatology and the ability to accurately recall an event historiographically, it exists on an inverse sliding scale. So revisiting the work of Dr. Ruth Lays, who gives us this term specular distance, she says, quote, "From the beginning, trauma was understood as an experience that immersed the victim in the traumatic scene so profoundly that it precluded the kind of specular distance necessary for cognitive knowledge of what happened." End quote. So the question is then, to what degree and by what method a survivor is able to regain the specular distance necessary to give a credible account of the abuse. Recent work of Bessel van der Kolk theorizes that traumatic memory is encoded neurobiologically or in a somatoform way in the body, rather than cognitively or explicitly in the mind. And this accounts, van der Kolk argues, for the enduring nature of trauma throughout a lifetime and for the dysregulative symptoms that it produces. So van der Kolk argues that traumatic memory, distinctively traumatic memory, is neither declarative nor narrative memory, but rather something more like implicit or non-declarative or non-explicit memory, in which the survivor acts out the trauma and reacts to it through skills and reflexes and habits and classically conditioned responses that lie outside the scope and the domain of verbal semantic linguistic representation. And this idea that trauma is embedded beneath the conscious, beneath conscious awareness rather, and is play acted out by the survivor symbolically and metaphorically through other attachments, this is called mimesis. And this is the notion that the survivor metaphorically mimes the trauma and acts it out in a way that is representative, but not denotatively or straightforwardly literal or conscious or explicit. Okay? So classic psychoanalysis, which is, the Freudian German-oriented school of thought, assumes a mimetic suppression of the trauma. Whereas conversely, contemporary positivist accounts, which is like a mainly cognitive behaviorist pragmatist psychology, carries out an anti-mimetic agenda, which is to lead the survivor out of the metaphoric or implicit world through hypnosis or coercion, that is, through entering into a game of therapy to find one's way from metaphoricality to literality, to a place of cognizant and autonomous self-expression. Okay, so the goal of therapy then is to lead someone from the implicit knowledge of their trauma to the explicit knowledge of their trauma, from the symbolic, mimetic acting out of their trauma to the autonomous, expressive, anti-mimetic declarational knowledge about their trauma. So the mimetic hypothesis begins with the notion that accounts of abuse by the victim are impeded by the trauma itself. That accuracy is occluded by the trauma itself, whereas the anti-mimetic hypothesis holds to the fundamental recoverability of traumatic events. Okay, so we need to keep this distinction between competing mimetic and anti-mimetic theories of trauma in mind as we consider the relationship between trauma and memory. Now, what theory should we use to understand Christine Blasey Ford? It's very unclear, and to present the science as dictating dogmatically a bias for or against Ford is scientifically, diagnostically, and philosophically dishonest in ignoring the theoretical and clinical and practical variegation and variability of the science as it stands. And we ought to finally make one note here about the possibility of false memories. Now, I'm not saying that this is what happened, okay? What I'm saying is that Ford maintains that she had always remembered the event, okay? But she suppressed it in order to hide from her parents the fact that she was drinking and for various other reasons, okay? But she was always conscious of it, and that's the story that she has given on record, okay? So we have to be on the lookout for common sense tropes masked under the guise of trauma experts that are seeking to sell unscientific observation as research profundity. We have to be on the lookout for that, okay? Because people are reading these articles on the Washington Post and New York Times and even Fox News and CNN, and people are saying, oh, okay, the trauma science is settled, and she's lying, or she's confused, or she's telling the truth. No. You can't do that. You cannot do that. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but we have to be on the lookout against people who are selling themselves as trauma experts. You are likely not a trauma expert, and the people that they are talking to are likely not trauma experts. And very often the utilization of trauma science, what Ian Hacking had called memorial politics, it skews data. It skews data and it misrepresents research. And for this reason, we need to make a meaningful distinction. Okay, one which the current conversation completely ignores and lacks. We need to make a distinction between abuse and trauma, okay? Abuse is something which occurs historically and objectively and is an event that can be measurably observed in what, Isaac Newton would call the plane of extension, the observable physical universe, okay? Trauma is something which occurs in one's internal world, most often as a response to those Newtonian external realities, but increasingly due to self-application and overutilization of the trauma concept for oneself. How is it possible to work sort of retro-inductively from the traumatic memory itself to the abusive event when there have been cases of false memory? And most techniques used for memory recovery are the same methods used for creating memory distortion in laboratory studies like hypnosis and guided imagery, okay? And there is a therapeutic culture, especially in the United States, in which we confuse catharsis and emotionality and authenticity for truthfulness, okay? There is a degree to which authenticity and tears represent a narrative or a figurative truth that we too much now in 2018 have confused and replaced with a necessary foundation for understanding historical reality, and that's simply not the case. So there are psychologists named Lindsay and Reed who wrote and published a very, very in-depth and long paper on this issue in the Journal of Applied Cognitive Psychology, explaining how is it possible that people could believe false memories of abuse and false memories of trauma. How is that possible? And I want to read a quote from that article. Quote, "We suspect that one of the most compelling reasons that memory recovery therapists often accept memories of childhood sexual abuse as accurate accounts is the tremendous emotional intensity and pain their clients experience when recovering such memories. How could one be skeptical of a sobbing, grief-stricken client when she comes to remember being raped by her father? As one scholar noted, the unendurable and impossible to fake agony of the clients is the most powerful evidence for the truth of their experiences. From our perspective, however, the experience of coming to believe that such events occurred would be tremendously traumatic, regardless of whether the remembered events actually happened or are the product of suggestive questioning and other memory recovery techniques. The experience of remembering or believing is not fake, even in cases when it is based on factors other than retrieval of accurate memories. Our point here is not to suggest that all or even most memories recovered in therapy are illusory, but rather to emphasize that there are good reasons to believe that 1. Some recollections produced by intensive memory recovery therapy may be false, and 2, when such techniques are used, it is very difficult to discriminate between clients who are remembering accurately and clients who believe they are remembering accurately, but are not," end quote. So this is a basic assumption in good psychological science, that mental health professionals operate credibly within the domain of one's internal world, okay? They are not licensed investigators. They are not historiographers. They are not law enforcement agents. They are not detectives. They understand, presumably, human experience and behavior. The broader philosophical, historical, and legal implications and domains of trauma and of these experiences exist outside the scope of mental health professions and credibility and credentials. And the degree to which traumatic memory is true or false is only relevant to the mental health professional for psychological reasons, unless it becomes incumbent for them to contact, of course, local law enforcement authorities. So, do false memories of abuse exist? Yes. Can a traumatic interpretation of a memory, so I'm seeing it as traumatic now and it wasn't traumatic before. So can a traumatic interpretation of a memory be retrofitted onto a previous version of that memory, which was not traumatizing, so that through therapy, well, now I'm re-remembering and re-encoding that memory with a traumatized gloss? That's very possible. Is it possible? Yes. Does this indicate anything about the veracity of these claims? No. Is trauma a highly suggestive concept? Yes, it is. That's why social scientists studying the trauma concept are noting that there is now a concept creep happening within the term that is causing those who self-identify as traumatized to balloon, because this concept is becoming more and more generic and more popular, as a recent article in the journal Psychological Inquiry has noted. Okay? Does this entail anything about the Ford allegations against Kavanaugh? No, it does not. It means that it means what we have been saying all along, which is this, that the traumatic nature of Ford's memory entails nothing whatsoever. That's as much as anybody is able to say about the relationship between trauma and memory in the Ford Kavanaugh situation. There are things that could be happening, and there are things that could not be happening. That's literally all we know. So I'm going to conclude here with 4 points. First, we must not allow our understanding of trauma to be controlled by the joystick of political expediency, okay? That goes for our scientific and our popular understanding of the trauma concept. There are very few conservative academics interested in trauma studies, and for that reason, trauma has become the central cog of the intersectionality machine. And trauma measured along the lines of ethnic and class identity has become a way to measure political and cultural and social and even individual entitlement, rather than as a way to better diagnose and overcome overwhelming suffering in the lives of unique individuals. And this co-opting of trauma, this co-opting of the trauma concept by leftists is one of the greatest tragedies and bastardizations of psychological science since phrenology was used in the 19th century as an attempt to distinguish between blacks and whites. Okay? Second, we must reclaim the legitimation of male trauma. This very concept is mocked by intersectionality politics because trauma is, in the leftist perspective, the metric of oppression, and conceived in that lens is absurd to apply to white males. It belongs properly in the humanities to politics, to group politics, and to identity politics, and derivatively only so to individuals. But the opposite is actually the case, and the history of the trauma concept bears this out. Trauma as a concept arose in the context of accounting for individual experiences, not group experiences, and of American soldiers, no less. Okay? So-called group trauma is an abstraction from the actual trauma concept, okay? Group trauma is an abstraction from actual trauma, and actual trauma explains individual experience per se, not group obligation or entitlement, okay? It is odd and hypocritical for intersectionality actors to self-identify as advocates for trauma and mock the notion of trauma among men. To reduce the fact that men kill themselves at a rate 300% higher than women, and to reduce that to their male fragility and their white fragility, is a heinous classification that unveils the ugly and selfish motives of those intersectionality actors, okay? Boys are abused. Men are crushed. Men are even falsely accused. And they deserve as much as any other human to name and grieve their suffering without having to measure their trauma against the pain of others. And to ignore and to mock and even publicly chastise men and white men for processing their pain is evil and racist and sexist. And if there's one thing that trauma literature bears out, it's that traumas do not need to compete with each other. Traumas do not need to compete with one another. Suffering is not a zero-sum game. Lamentation is not a zero-sum game. And to say as much is as outdated as racism and sexism itself. Third, we must make an operational distinction between proper protocol in therapy and proper protocol in politics. What an abuse survivor needs in therapy will not be honored and should not override proper political protocol. Okay? To the degree that a survivor enters into the political arena, whether to lodge an allegation or as a political actor, he or she forgoes certain therapeutic protocol that a mental health professional would afford them in a private setting. We should not and cannot subjugate the last 2,000 years of progress in political theory, from Plato's organismic theory to Aristotle's politeia to Locke to Burke and to our founding fathers. Our system of justice is the closest thing to heaven we've ever had on this earth. And to regress our system to mob justice would be a tragedy. We must delegate the execution of proper political protocol to elected officials just as much as we delegate the authority to execute proper therapeutic protocol to mental health professionals. Okay? We don't put infantry in charge of our military strategy. We don't put diabetics in charge of insulin research, and we don't put abuse survivors in charge of mitigating allegations in court hearings and the adjudication of public officials. The notion that we ought to usurp the delegative mechanism that we have baked into the Republican structure of our government will regress our political theory to a direct democracy that is actually bad for survivors of abuse when political interests of the majority no longer align with protecting such victims, okay? It's called the tyranny of the majority, and it's a bad system. Third, we must never give up due process. Due process is slow because it is the line in the sand between human beings and the bestial desire for vengeance. Okay? The slowness of due process is not the weakness of our evidentiary standard, but the strength of the process. Okay? It allows us to guarantee the certainty of our practices of justice. Due process, slow as it might be, and it's by virtue of its slowness, fortifies the integrity of the justice we execute. It allows the execution of justice to be as irrefutable as possible. So the whole believe all women trope is simply absurd. That doesn't mean we don't listen. It means the opposite, okay? That doesn't mean we don't pursue justice rigorously through the proper channels. But the notion that women are fundamentally more truthful than men is sexist, and it is a rot in the floorboards of justice. And if that is ever institutionally baked into our process of executing the law, we are doomed. And for this, I will close with a comment by Christine Blasey Ford herself, who uses the process of prosecuting allegations as an example of good science in her recent psychology textbook. Blasey Ford and her co-author comment, quote, "It is important to realize that one cannot plan a cost-effective psychological study without any background or preliminary information, any more than a prosecutor would institute a trial by jury without evidence to back the charge," end quote. Being traumatized does not disqualify Ford's testimony, but it hardly qualifies it either. At the end of the day, the science about trauma is simply not strong enough to infer the degree of her statement's accuracy. Anyone wielding psychological science about trauma in order to authenticate the veracity of her statement is simply not saturated in the trauma literature. This includes Ford herself, who, as a specialist in psychometrics and social statistics, ought to recognize the fragile status of the trauma concept and its surrounding science, and therefore the dubious role it could possibly play in the adjudication of justice in a public setting.